On a Wednesday evening in July, in a sitting room on Renfield Street, Nathaniel Vance was about to ruin himself on
I
purpose.
can no longer live
He
with
had
this
spent
silence.
11 years building a name that could survive scrutiny, a reputation engineered against every objection a snob could raise, without a single reckless decision. Not one. Until tonight, when he intended to ask a baronet's daughter to marry him, with no argument prepared, no fallback, no way to take it back if she said no. Cassandra Wren did not yet know it was coming. She would later say she'd known for weeks and simply refused to admit it, which was the most honest thing she ever said about herself. In a few minutes he would say 4 words. She would answer in less time than it took him to finish asking. And the two of them, who had each spent the better part of a year, convinced they'd had the other's measure within 5 minutes of meeting, would discover, not for the first time, how completely they had been wrong. To understand how they got there, we have to go back to a ballroom in April, and a sentence her father should never have said with the door open. Sir Aldous Wren had a habit of saying true things at the worst possible volume. "My dear," he told his daughter, outside the ballroom doors of Lord Renfrew's house, "you have read yourself out of the market." He said it the way a man says something he has repeated so many times it has stopped sounding like a warning and started sounding like weather. Cassandra had heard it every season for 3 years running. She had stopped flinching at it sometime during the second. "I'm aware, Papa," she said, and went in without waiting for him. She did not need to look back to know that several people within earshot had heard it too. She had long since decided the alternative. Flinching, apologizing, performing a modesty she didn't feel, cost more than the gossip did. Nathaniel Vance, 3 feet away with an untouched glass of claret, heard every word. He hadn't come to Renfrew House to enjoy himself. Lord Renfrew owed him £400, and an evening's goodwill was cheaper than his bank, which was precisely why the invitation had come. Nathaniel was 32, the son of a Leeds woolcomber who died owing more than he'd ever earned, and he'd spent 11 years turning a talent for numbers, and a far larger talent for patience, into a position useful men found indispensable, and not quite respectable enough to seat above the salt. He watched the baronet's daughter cross the floor and noted 3 things in quick succession. She moved like a woman who'd decided where she was going before the music started. 2 clusters of people turned to greet her with real pleasure rather than careful welcome. And she was performing. He was nearly certain of it. A woman whose own father announced her cleverness in a public hallway was a woman who'd learned to wear that cleverness as a costume, the one feature guaranteed to set her apart from every other accomplished young lady in the room. Miss Wren had clearly been practicing. He intended to find Lord Renfrew, extract a vague promise about repayment, and leave before supper. He had a meeting at 10 the next morning with a Leeds merchant named Calloway, who was deciding whether to trust him with a contract that mattered more than anything else he'd built in a decade. He did not have time for a woman who'd perfected the art of seeming unrehearsed. He lasted 35 minutes. Cassandra was near the cardroom doors with Mrs. Eliza Carrow, a widow of 36 with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, and a young man Nathaniel didn't know. As he passed within range, he caught the thread of it. "But your assuming character is fixed at birth, Lord Brackley, like the color of a man's eyes," Cassandra was saying. "I don't think a single example either of us could name actually bears that out." "It's the entire foundation of how a gentleman is raised," Brackley said, with the stiffness of a man unused to losing arguments in public. "Breeding and expectation form a man's character before he's old enough to choose anything for himself. They form circumstance. Character is what a person does with the circumstance once they're old enough to notice it's there." "Miss Wren," said Mrs. Carrow, catching Nathaniel's eye with open delight, "you must meet Mr. Vance. He built an entire career out of becoming something he wasn't born to. He can settle the point rather better than Lord Brackley." Brackley, sensing he'd stopped being part of the conversation, excused himself toward the cardroom. Nathaniel bowed to Cassandra. "Mr. Vance," she said, her eyes assessing him in roughly 2 seconds. He counted, out of habit. "Is character built, deliberately, out of what a man chooses to do, or simply the shape his circumstances left him?" "Built," he said. Deliberately. I inherited nothing useful. Everything I have, I chose to make, one decision at a time. A practical answer, I'd have thought that was a compliment. Accuracy and compliment aren't always the same thing. A pause. You've only answered the part that flatters you. You built your circumstances. Did you build your character, or did 11 years of necessity simply leave you no other shape to take? He hadn't expected that. That's not an unreasonable question. It's a correct one. It's a preliminary. The actual argument follows from it, and you haven't made it yet. Her chin lifted, very slightly. Then consider it a preliminary. I look forward to making the rest of it. I look forward to hearing it, he said, meaning to end the conversation politely before supper. She took it as a promise. Then you shall. She was drawn away by a young woman in pale green, and Mrs. Caro turned to Nathaniel, delighted. She's articulate, he said. She's considerably more than that, and you know it. She's performing. Father announces her cleverness in his own hallway. She walks in arguing philosophy. It's a strategy. For distinction. For a husband vain enough to find it flattering. Mrs. Caro looked at him, the way a woman looks at a man she's decided, with real affection, is being an idiot. Mr. Vance, you are occasionally remarkably stupid for an intelligent man. She went to find someone less exhausting. Nathaniel stood watching Cassandra Wren across the ballroom, with the irritating certainty that he was right. The young woman in pale green was Miss Octavia Lane, Cassandra's closest friend since they were 14. Lord Brackley called on your father yesterday, she murmured. About you? My father said nothing of it. He wouldn't. Not till Brackley actually asks. Octavia studied her. Are you not alarmed? I'm mostly curious how a man who thinks character is fixed at birth expects to marry a woman who thinks the opposite. Cassandra accepted lemonade from a passing footman. I have no objection to him. I simply have no intention of marrying him. You have no intention of marrying anyone. That isn't quite true. She glanced, without meaning to, at Nathaniel Vance across the room, his back deliberately to her. And there was a difference between a man who simply wasn't looking and one who'd decided not to. She'd learned over several seasons to tell which was which. What would it take, Octavia asked, to actually intend it? Being known, properly. Chosen because someone looks at the whole of me and can't imagine doing otherwise. Not because the settlement is convenient. He did not look at her again before he left. He had formed his opinion. Clever, quick, engaged in the long project of making herself the most interesting woman in any room. Not unattractive. Simply not his business. He walked out into the cold April night, and the word she'd used, deliberate, followed him home like something he hadn't agreed to carry. He went to Aldridge's on Piccadilly the following Tuesday on a solicitor's errand that turned out to be wrong information. What he found instead, 3 feet from the counter, was Cassandra Wren, reading, not browsing, reading, with the stillness of someone who'd genuinely forgotten where she was. Miss Wren. She looked up, returning from wherever the book had taken her. Mr. Vance. He nodded at the volume. Anything worth recommending? Wollstonecraft, though I suspect you've read her. I haven't. I find what's immediately useful worth my time. Philosophy is generally argued by people secure enough to afford it. I haven't had that security. That's not what I asked. She tilted her head. Did you not have it? Or did you decide you couldn't afford to want it? I didn't have it. I read what would keep me employed. She might have helped you understand the people employing you. I understood them well enough. I just didn't always like what I understood. The corner of her mouth moved. Neither did she. She slid the book back onto its shelf. You also weren't fair to my argument the first time. You answered the surface of it, because the substance would have required taking it, and me, seriously. And you'd already decided not to. He had, in fact, done exactly that. I'll endeavor to address the substance. I'll hold you to it. She left with a small nod. Nathaniel stood by the counter, reviewing a conversation that had gone nothing like he'd predicted. She had conceded that he'd built something real, without the smirk he'd expected. She had also told him plainly he'd been ungenerous, both more honest than performance required. He filed it away. The drawer was getting crowded. At Mrs. Penrose's dinner, Cassandra sat between a colonel with opinions about the peninsula and a clergyman with stronger ones about the colonel. Nathaniel sat across and 3 places down, close enough that when she looked toward the center of the table, she looked toward him too, whether she meant to or not. He was telling Mrs. Penrose about rebuilding Lord Renfrew's granary roof, not repeating what he'd been told, but speaking as a man who'd stood under the half-finished timbers and looked up. Cassandra found this more interesting than she'd expected to. When the ladies withdrew, Octavia found her at once. "He keeps looking at you." "He thinks I'm performing," Cassandra said. "It's what a practical man thinks. The first time he meets a woman who argues philosophy at a ball, he assumes there's a strategy." "Is there?" "The strategy is that I find it genuinely interesting. Apparently, the hardest thing in the world to believe." When the men rejoined them, Nathaniel crossed the room directly. "You owed me an argument. The preliminary, from Renfrew's. You remembered that." "I'm not ending the conversation this time." "Very well." She held his gaze. "Survival narrows choice. It doesn't remove it. Some men cut corners inside the narrowest circumstance. Some become exactly as hard as they need to be, and not 1 degree harder. Choosing which kind to be is the entire content of character. Everything else is just the room." He was quiet a moment. "That's not unreasonable. It's correct. Whether it's correct depends on whether most men, given the narrowest room, actually have more than one way through it, or only believe they did, after the fact, because the alternative is uncomfortable to admit. Is that a real objection, or are you protecting yourself from the compliment?" His mouth moved, almost a smile. "That's a better question than I expected. I occasionally ask better ones than expected. It's when you decide in advance that no better question is needed that you become unreliable." He didn't flinch. "That's fair." She turned to answer Mrs. Carrow and was aware, the rest of the evening, of exactly where he stood without once looking at him. This was new. She filed the feeling away as inconvenient. Lord Brackley called in Renfield Street the following Friday, punctual, with hothouse violets. Sir Aldous received him warmly and excused himself with transparent tact. "Miss Wren, I hope you'll allow me to speak plainly," Brackley said. "Our conversations this season have been of unusual quality. You aren't flattered into agreement. I find that admirable." He looked at her directly. "I should like to continue them in a more permanent capacity." He didn't say wife. It sat in the room regardless. Cassandra looked at him properly. He was genuinely pleasant. He would be kind for a year, perhaps 18 months, and then find her exhausting, and they would settle into a careful civil distance lasting 40 years. "I'm honored, truly," she said, "but I can't accept. What you admire is that I argue well. I want someone who argues back and doesn't yield the moment it costs him something to keep going." "I would argue back. You would yield, eventually, to keep the peace, and I'd know it. Neither of us would be happy for very long." He sat with that, with the pained respect of a man receiving an accurate diagnosis. "You're very certain. About this?" "Yes." He rose, collected his hat. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Miss Wren." "I hope so too." She saw him out herself, and passed her father in the hall. "Well," he said. "He was perfectly adequate, Papa. I don't want adequate." Sir Aldous made the sound he'd been making for 3 seasons. Not quite a sigh. "My dear, you have read yourself out of the market." "So you've said." She kissed his cheek. "I find I'm not yet convinced that's a bad position to be in." It was only later that she realized it was the first time she hadn't simply agreed with him. Brackley tried again 3 weeks later at the Calverton Assembly, requesting a second dance she granted, on the reasonable assumption it was simply a second dance. It was, she understood as the set ended. a renewed campaign. "I've thought about what you said," he told her quietly. "That character is built rather than given. I think you're wrong. Choosing happens constantly, in habits no one's watching. By the time circumstance tests a man, the choosing's already done. There's none left to do." It was a reasonable counter-argument, with a flaw, made by a man who'd gone away and actually thought. "That's meaningfully better than your first," she said sincerely. "It doesn't change my answer." The room had begun, without seeming to pay attention. "I see," he said. "I'm sorry, genuinely." "I believe you are." He held himself with a dignity she respected thoroughly. "I shan't press further." He bowed and walked toward the card room. Cassandra found Mrs. Carrow at the edge of the floor. "Admirably handled," Mrs. Carrow said. "It was necessary. It was both. How are you?" "Perfectly well." She was also aware that Nathaniel had watched the whole exchange from the windows. She didn't look at him. "He was a good prospect," Mrs. Carrow observed, in the voice she used when she wasn't being neutral at all. "Most good men are. The question is whether good is sufficient. It hasn't been for me. Not yet." "No," Mrs. Carrow agreed, glancing briefly across the room. "I don't imagine it has." Nathaniel had meant to leave by 11. He stood in the carriage queue afterward, dismantling the conclusion he'd reached in Renfrew's ballroom 6 weeks earlier. She had not been performing composure tonight. She had composure, which was an altogether different thing, the face of a woman who'd decided what she wanted, and was paying, without complaint, whatever it cost her. She was not performing. She was, he could find no more precise word, simply herself, fully, in every room she entered. The cleverness wasn't deployed. It was present, the way height is present. And she had stopped, long ago, managing the fact of having it. He thought about the word deliberate, and whether he'd heard it correctly the first time. He didn't think he had. The gossip reached him on a Wednesday by way of a clerk who passed along information he hadn't been asked for, pleased with himself, unaware of the weight of it. A Mrs. Fenhurst had been heard, at 2 gatherings, suggesting Miss Wren's refusals indicated an existing attachment. Improper, unnamed, not the sort one introduces. It would not destroy her. It would simply make every season after this one harder than it needed to be. Nathaniel barely knew Miss Wren. 4 real conversations, by his count. He had no claim on her, no reason to involve himself. He also knew Mrs. Fenhurst sat on charity committees with Lady Aldermere, whose opinion Mrs. Fenhurst considered very important indeed. It was a matter of 15 minutes and one well-placed conversation. He called on Lady Aldermere, conducted real business, and in the last 5 minutes mentioned, with perfect casualness, a curious story about a Miss Wren that he was sure she could put to rest. Lady Aldermere, who disliked Mrs. Fenhurst and liked the Wrens, set the record straight that very afternoon, at her own gathering, in front of 7 women who would distribute it to every relevant drawing room within 2 days. Nathaniel walked home without mentioning his own name once. He told no one what he'd done. Mrs. Carrow found Cassandra at the lending library that Saturday. Entirely by coincidence, she said. And Cassandra, who'd never known her to do anything by genuine coincidence, waited for the rest of it. "Mrs. Fenhurst suggested you had a private attachment beneath your station." Lady Aldermere corrected it thoroughly, with unusual enthusiasm. Surprising, since she doesn't normally trouble herself over other people's daughters, unless someone she values has given her reason to. Mrs. Carrow smoothed her glove. "Mr. Vance called on her that same Thursday morning. You don't know he said anything." "No, I'm assembling a theory, which you, of all people, can hardly object to as a method." Cassandra sat with it, a man who had quietly repaired a rumor and told no one, who'd done it precisely enough that she hadn't even known to be grateful. "What do you make of him?" she asked. "I think he decided very young The world wasn't going to give him anything, and arranged his life accordingly. Admirable, and I suspect rather lonely. He doesn't seem lonely. He seems contained. Not the same thing. Mrs. Caro rose. He is occasionally very stupid for an intelligent man. I don't believe the stupidity is permanent. The word deliberate rose in Cassandra's mind, in his voice, and it sounded different than it had 3 weeks ago. She did not seek him out. That mattered to her. But she made no effort, at Mrs. Aldis's Tuesday musical, to find the far side of the room from him. This was new. For weeks she'd been managing distance without noticing she was doing it. She noticed, now, that she'd stopped. He crossed the room without his usual small hesitation and took the chair beside her without asking whether it was free. It was, and the not asking was a small thing that wasn't small at all. My mother played this piece, badly but often, he said, of the sonata. She died when I was 11. You don't speak of her. She'd have liked this room. Strong opinions about curtains. A specific passion, very few others. My father has strong opinions about almanacs, Cassandra offered. He hasn't been entirely clear on the logic. He smiled then, fully, and it changed his whole face. I understand you called on Lady Aldermere recently, she said, before she'd quite decided to. The smile became more careful. I call on her with some regularity. On a Thursday, the same Thursday, she corrected a rumor about me, with unusual enthusiasm. Lady Aldermere is a thorough woman. That's a very carefully worded non-denial, Mr. Vance. He looked at her directly. Yes, it is. She held his gaze, and for the first time since the ballroom, she understood the looking, not inventory, not dismissal. He found her difficult to look away from, and had finally stopped pretending otherwise. Thank you, she said simply, without the irony she kept close for moments that mattered too much. He nodded once. He didn't say it was nothing. They both knew it wasn't. The next piece began. They sat through it without speaking, and the silence was the most comfortable she'd shared with anyone in years. Octavia arrived the next morning, already prepared. You like him? He's interesting, Cassandra admitted. He did something for me without telling anyone. That's a particular kind of character. He's also a man of business without title, and the world has opinions about that arrangement. Do you have opinions about it? I have the opinion that it's a complicated practical question. You said practical the way you say it when you're using it as a wall. Cassandra opened her mouth, closed it. They met 3 more times that fortnight. In the park, at a morning call, and at a card party at the Penroses, where neither played, and they stood near the fire and talked about Leeds. He'd grown up behind a wool warehouse, a father who smelled of lanolin, a mother dying of something no doctor named until she was nearly gone. When did you come to London? 19. £11 and an introduction from my father's last employer, written the week before he died. I've never been sure if it was guilt or genuine confidence. He watched the card table rather than her. I learned the accounts in 6 weeks, everything else in 8 months. After that, I found people who knew more and made myself useful to them. You're entirely self-made. It's both satisfying and exhausting, simultaneously, most days. A pause. How did you become what you are? My father's library. I found it at 12. By 15, I'd read everything twice, and no one objected especially hard. He objects in principle and is wildly inconsistent in practice. Reminds me I've read myself out of the market, then leaves me alone in the library for 3 days. I think he's proud. He has no language for being proud of a daughter who reads at breakfast. He looked at her steadily. The look she'd learned was neither calculation nor dismissal. It frightens people, he said. A woman fully formed before anyone's claimed her. It removes a certain story, the one where she's completed by the marriage. That story has always struck me as convenient for whoever's doing the completing. Deliberate, he said. She turned sharply. He said it with exact, dry weight, handing the word back in the tone she'd first used it, when she'd meant it as a verdict on his lack of imagination. Don't, she said, already nearly smiling. I mean it sincerely this time. Choosing who completes the story, or refusing to let anyone, that's the most deliberate thing I've watched anyone do in years. That's a significant revision of your first position. I thought the library, the arguing, the refusing, I thought it was strategy, a campaign for a husband vain enough to find it flattering. He looked at the fire instead of her. Now I think you're the most genuinely whole person I've met in 11 years, and I think I was an idiot. You were an idiot, she agreed. So was I. I thought you found me ridiculous. Never, he said, quiet and entirely certain. We were both wrong about each other simultaneously, at least it's symmetrical. Deliberate of you, he said, a joke now, not a contested word. And she laughed properly, and he watched her do it with the attention of a man who'd been waiting for something, without admitting he was waiting. Her hand nearly reached for his. Not quite. The moment folded itself away. The letter arrived without warning. Josiah Calloway, a Leeds merchant who'd all but agreed to retain Nathaniel for a shipping contract that would settle every remaining question about whether he was a man worth serious money, had reconsidered. Not because Nathaniel was inadequate, because Calloway's son Edwin, freshly returned from Italy with opinions and taste, had decided his father shouldn't do business with that class of man. Losing the contract wasn't ruinous in itself. It was the chain of it. Calloway would mention it. Others would quietly ask not whether Nathaniel was competent, but whether he was the kind of man one was seen engaging. What he needed was a connection whose name ended that question before it started, which meant presenting himself as unencumbered, a man without complications. He thought of Cassandra Wren, a baronet's daughter who argued Wollstonecraft in bookshops and turned down lords, a woman who would, if anyone connected the two of them, become exactly the conspicuous attachment his prospective clients' families would notice and judge. Not because she was unworthy, because his standing was still precarious enough that anything remarked on would cost him. He was, he told himself, being practical. He wrote to his remaining prospects. He told himself the distance was necessary, with the consistency of a man who doesn't entirely believe it. On the fifth day, at a small gathering at the Aldermares, he made certain to stay on the far side of the room from her. She noticed. He knew because she didn't look at him once, the precise mirror of what he'd done himself, weeks earlier, before he'd stopped. He left early. On the pavement outside, in the cold, he understood with perfect clarity he was about to do something he would regret. He did it anyway. May turned to June. Cassandra moved through it with her usual efficiency and felt, underneath it, an irritation she didn't name until the second week. The irritation was hurt. He had stopped pretending he wasn't watching her, and then, with no explanation, the distance had simply returned. Not the early distance of a man who thought her a performance. The cold, deliberate distance of a man who'd decided something else entirely. Without her. About her. She picked her wit back up like a coat she'd set down. Several people remarked that Miss Wren was in particularly fine form this season. She was, because she'd decided fine form was all she intended to offer anyone, for the time being. Mrs. Carrow found her at a morning call. We're doing it again. Performing. It doesn't suit you. It suits you less now, because I've seen what you look like when you've stopped. He withdrew, without explanation. Cassandra chose her next word with care. I'd only just let myself consider it. That wasn't comfortable to discover. No. May I tell you something about Mr. Vance I wasn't certain was mine to tell? He spent a long time being careful about what's allowed to attach to his name. Not vanity, necessity. His position has always been more precarious than it looks. Any complication would be used against him by people looking for an excuse. Mrs. Carrow paused. He isn't withdrawing because he's lost interest. He's calculated he can't afford the cost of not withdrawing. He's protecting everything he built from nothing. I know that. She did know it. She'd listened to him describe it in the firelight. But I'm not a complication. He thinks you might be seen as one. A baronet's daughter who argues philosophy and turns down lords is, by London's accounting, conspicuous. He's a man who spent a decade calculating risk for a living. I imagine he's miscalculated this one rather badly. Do I want him to understand this? Cassandra asked, or simply want him to have behaved differently? That, Mrs. Carrow said, is something only you can answer. The man who made Nathaniel see his miscalculation clearly was his solicitor, Hollis. Dry, exacting, billing by the hour, regardless of feelings. You've read the third clause twice without comment, Hollis said. You always comment on the third clause. The Callaway matter is settled. I've drawn the replacement agreements. I also know you've attended fewer social engagements these 3 weeks than any comparable stretch in 2 years, which, for a man whose engagements are professional necessity, is illness or avoidance. You track my engagements. I track your professional development. It's the same thing, in your case. You're telling yourself avoidance is necessary, and you're miserable about it, which is precisely how I know it's the wrong decision. You've never once been miserable about a correct one. Callaway withdrew because of his son. That objection will be made by others. By idiots. You've never managed your affairs around the opinions of idiots. You manage them around competent men who respect what you've built. Those men won't care a whit about whatever attachment you're avoiding, assuming it's as respectable as I suspect. She's a baronet's daughter. Then the concern is imaginary. Hollis picked up his pen. Shall we return to the fourth clause? Nathaniel looked out the window instead. He had spent 3 weeks being afraid, and dressed the fear in the language of calculation. It was the one form of cowardice he'd never previously indulged. If a man has behaved badly and wishes to correct it, he said, what's the first step? In life, Hollis said, not looking up, the first step is always to go and say so. He went to Renfield Street with no appointment. He waited in the hall, looking at the vase of late spring flowers, thinking of her telling him her father objected to her reading in principle and was inconsistent in practice, and the fondness in her voice, and how she'd shown him, repeatedly, exactly who she was, and how it had taken him 3 months to see it, and then, having seen it, he had flinched. He was not a man who flinched. He was a man who calculated, and he had calculated wrongly, and the cost was personal, larger than anything he'd risked in 11 careful years. She received him in the sitting room, composed, not performing it, simply feeling it and wearing it. I owe you an explanation. You owe me nothing. We have no formal understanding. I'm offering one regardless. He told her about Callaway, about the calculation. I decided you might be seen as a complication by people whose opinion I was still cultivating. I was wrong, factually and otherwise, and I was wrong to decide it without telling you. You let me believe I'd been mistaken about you again, she said slowly. I had let my guard down. Deliberately. That isn't easy for me. Then you withdrew, with no explanation, and I concluded my judgment had been catastrophically poor. Your judgment wasn't poor. Mine was. That isn't entirely comforting. I know. Everything I have, I built by being careful. I applied that same carefulness to you and to what I was beginning to feel, and it was entirely the wrong instrument. What are you beginning to feel? She asked, with the courage of someone afraid to want the answer. That you're the most interesting person I've met in 11 years of London. That I've thought about you every day since Renfrew's Ballroom. That I find your arguments, even when I think they're wrong, worth more than most people's agreement. That I've missed you specifically, not the idea of you. The word deliberate rose in her again, and for the first time she understood what it had meant all along. I told myself my caution was practical, she said. Then you withdrew, and it wasn't practical at all. It was fear. of having been seen, of having let myself be known, and then losing the person who knew me. I know he'd spent 11 years thoroughly defended and discovered the defenses had a door he hadn't known existed. We've both been very stupid, simultaneously. At least it's efficient. Deliberately so, he said, with the exact weight of a man returning a word they both knew the whole history of. Mr. Vance. Miss Wren. A pause. Cassandra. She had never seen that expression on him before. Not the near smile, not the careful assessment, something entirely open. Nathaniel, she said, his name in her voice. In this room, after everything. It was the most intimate thing that had happened between them. I believe you owe me an argument, she said. You've been absent from the conversation 3 weeks. I've accumulated several points. I want you to understand, I'm not the complication you were afraid of. The world will form its opinions. It always does. But its opinion of you is already better than you think, and will be better still the day you stop treating yourself as provisional. That's a practical argument. It's a correct one, which isn't always the same thing, though in this case it happens to be both. He smiled, the full smile. It does happen, occasionally. Stay for tea, she said. He stayed. He proposed on a Wednesday evening, the first week of July, without a prepared speech and without flowers. He had become, in the weeks since, a regular caller, regular enough that Sir Aldous received him with the ease he reserved for men he'd decided to like. Cassandra was reading when he arrived. She no longer set the book down at his name being announced, and he had learned to sit and wait while she finished her paragraph. She finished it. She looked up. He was watching her with the open expression she'd come to understand was his actual face. Cassandra, you're about to say something significant. Your shoulders straighten very slightly when you've decided something. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to construct an argument for this. You'd dismantle it before I finish the second point. I want to spend the rest of my life arguing with you about character and Wollstonecraft and curtains. I want to be the one person who's allowed to know you fully and who you're allowed to know in return. He paused. I love you. I think I've loved you since the firelight at the Penroses, and probably before, and I've been extraordinarily slow to say so. You were slow, she agreed. So was I. At least it's symmetrical. Cassandra, will you marry me? Yes, she said. I will marry you. He laughed, low and genuine. A laugh she'd heard perhaps 4 times, and collected like evidence each time. Deliberate of you. Entirely. I've been waiting for something worth being deliberate about. He crossed to her. She let him take her hand, and the letting was the most deliberate thing she had done in 3 London seasons. The word, he said, between us. I want to know what it means now. She considered it with the seriousness she had liked in him from the start. It means real, not comfortable necessarily, not safe, real and specific, and chosen with full knowledge of what it costs. Chosen anyway, with no way of taking it back once it's done. That's what I'm choosing. And what I'm choosing, she said. Then we agree. Finally. He brought her hand to his lips, a formal gesture with no formality in it at all, and she felt it the entire length of herself. They were married in September, in the small church on Renfield Street, in a ceremony Sir Aldous called unnecessarily brief and entirely correct. Mrs. Carrow sat in the second row, permitting herself an expression of satisfaction she would deny for the rest of her natural life. Octavia wept with the happiness of someone who'd never doubted the outcome, only the timeline. Lord Brackley sent a generous gift and a genuinely warm note, which Cassandra read twice and kept. The following October, Cassandra sat at her writing desk in the house on Fenchurch Street, light-filled and large enough for the library she'd been quietly assembling. A half-finished manuscript to her left, a reply to a philosophical journal to her right, very good tea at her elbow. Noticeably with child by then, a fact she'd mostly stopped noticing. Nathaniel came in at 10, shedding his coat. Hollis sends his regards, and his opinion that the new clause in the Callaway Agreement is excellent. He doesn't say thoughtfully, "How did the meeting go?" Successfully. The flat satisfaction of a man for whom success had been long arriving and still felt remarkable. Callaway retained us formally, signed this morning. Callaway, the name she'd heard for 8 months, the name that meant the question was finally, conclusively settled. "You did it," she said. "We did it." He sat in the chair across from her desk, worn now at the arm. "You told me in this room my position was better than I believed. I didn't believe you. I'm frequently right. I know." He looked at her with the open expression that was still, after a year of marriage, the face she loved best. "Are you well? You look tired." "Both are true. Can they be both?" "That's a practical question." "A genuine one." She smiled. He smiled back. Outside, London went about its business. Inside, the fire was lit, the tea was good, and the woman who had read herself out of the market, by her father's own repeated accounting, sat across from the man she had chosen, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, and no way of taking it back. "Nor any wish to tell me," she said, "what you think of the fourth clause. It's frequently wrong, in a correctable direction." "That," he said, "is practically the same thing." She laughed. He didn't argue. The fire burned on, and neither of them for once had anything left to calculate.